The date generally given for the collapse of the Roman Empire is 476, and it's pinned to the overthrow of Emperor Romulus, who was only 10 or 11 years old at the time, by Odoacer, a barbarian leader of likely East Germanic descent. And he was 43 or so at the time, so he was much older. 13 years later, as a result of some diplomacy and wars, Theodoric, who was a king of the Ostrogoths, who were also Germanic, invaded the Italian peninsula in 489 and had conquered it by 490. And by 493, Odoacer had surrendered and Theodoric was in charge. It's under this man, who's sometimes called Theodoric the Great, that we find Boethius, whose writings we're going to be looking at today. So Boethius was born 4 years after that initial event that's taken as the end of the Roman Empire. Boethius was born in 480, and he died in 524 or 525. So he didn't live to be very old. He was only 44 or 45 when he died. He was born into an aristocratic family. He got a regular education in music, rhetoric, philosophy, those kinds of things. And Theodoric appointed him his master of offices in 522, which is only 2 or 3 years before Boethius' death. From what I can tell, the position of master of offices was something like prime minister to the king, or at least we might say chief of staff. He was the head of the government and of the court, though of course the king was still in charge. The king was not a figurehead. Something happened in between. It's not exactly clear what. It's known that Boethius was pretty active in exposing corruption, but he was then accused of treason. He was doing something to try to rebuild the relationship between the church in Rome and in Constantinople, but Theodoric was also fighting with the Byzantines at the time, and something happened, and Theodoric didn't like it. But also there might have been something else going on because, as I mentioned, Boethius was active about exposing corruption. So it's possible that he had made some enemies who then plotted against him. Whatever the reason, Boethius was imprisoned. And it's in prison that he wrote what he's best known for, which is this piece of writing called The Consolation of Philosophy. The Consolation of Philosophy is a dialogue between Boethius himself sitting in prison and a manifestation of philosophy in the form of a woman. And he's talking to her and she's consoling him. That's why it's the Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius is one figure who connected the classical age to the Middle Ages, not only because of the time during which he lived right at the end of the Roman Empire and at the beginning of the Middle Ages, but also in part because of some of the work that he did. He was Christian, but he was interested in reconciling Greek philosophy with Christian theology. And most importantly, he did a lot of translating of ancient Greek works into Latin, which were significant among those that were rediscovered 1,000 years later during the Renaissance. So it's important to remember Boethius in that way, that he was an important translator of ancient Greek work. And reading this short book of his was interesting because I saw it mentioned in passing somewhere and I made a note of it. But to be honest, I didn't expect to ever read it, just because it's not exactly characteristic of any time period. If you read Horace, that's Roman. If you read the Song of Roland, that's definitely medieval. If you read Hesiod, that's definitely Greek. And Boethius is at this transition point. But this transition point is significant because both the Middle Ages, which are more characterized by Christianity, and the classical period, which are more characterized by the philosophers of antiquity and pagan religion. Both of these periods are part of the history of Europe, and the combination of these two cultures would characterize European art and thinking for the next 1,500 years. And Boethius was an early example of a guy who was trying to connect these two. And in his writing, The Consolation of Philosophy, that's my cat. What, buddy? What do you need? He gets annoyed when I make recordings. In The Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius is reflecting on life. He's literally sitting in prison awaiting execution, which in a certain way we are all awaiting execution. But he has experienced a pretty severe turn of fortune. he had this high office, and now he has been sentenced to death. And in prison, he is reflecting on what matters in life, what's important, what's not important, what lasts, what doesn't last. And in doing this, he says a lot of grounded, solid, stoic things that let him endure his circumstance calmly and steadfastly. And he also does some reasoning about God, which was less interesting to me because since he was writing in the early 6th century, he did not try to answer objections to religious claims that likely did not really exist at the time. And so it sometimes seems that he is starting from a bad premise or a premise that he hasn't explained or argued enough. He's assuming a little bit too much. So those passages I left out. If you're interested in what 6th century Christians were thinking about God, then this is a nice example of that, certainly worth checking out for that reason. But I was more interested in how he was confronting this summit of hardship. Staring death in the face is perhaps the ultimate Stoic test. And this is the real situation that Boethius was in when he was writing these words. He wasn't doing a thought experiment. He wasn't saying, what if I were to die tomorrow? What would I think was important? He was really in that situation. After having not only his own worldly success, but his 2 sons were also appointed consuls by Theodoric, which was a great honor. He considered that his greatest honor, even above what he himself achieved. And now, having lost all that, he's once again recalibrating his view of the world to perhaps what it was before his success and to a philosophy that can endure all circumstances. If you have a philosophy or a view of the world and it can't be sustained even under extreme hardship, then it's really a philosophy of convenience. It's just because you haven't been hit by anything that has tested you in a certain way and that would probably shatter that philosophy. By the way, that reminds me of something. I had initially this week, I had read some novellas of Voltaire for which he is best known. Those are Candide, Zadig, and Micromegas, all of which were very good, and they're very short and they're easy to read. They're very action-packed and very funny. The reason why I didn't want to discuss them on the podcast was because I decided that really those are just better to read. There's obviously reflection in them. I'm going to give an example right now, but they're more funny and more enjoyable if you just read them. So I definitely recommend checking them out. One thing that we can pull from those is that in Candide, there's a character who he's sort of a philosopher. He's the mentor of the main character, whose name is Candide. The mentor's name is Pangloss. And Pangloss, throughout the whole story, while all of these things are going terribly, he's always saying, this is the best of all possible worlds, and I can't even say it, and everything is as good as it could possibly be. And meanwhile, they're getting whipped and abducted by pirates and hanged, and he keeps saying this thing, this sort of cliche that appears in philosophy sometimes, that everything is as good as it could possibly be. It's the best of all possible worlds. And I think part of what Boethius was doing, of course, Voltaire was writing 1100 years, 1200 years after Boethius, so they weren't answering each other, but they were addressing similar problems. Though he doesn't state this as his goal, what Boethius is doing is to try to articulate a philosophy that can withstand bad circumstances. If you have this philosophy that everything is as good as it could possibly be, or everything works out for the best, and then really terrible things happen, then your faith could be shaken. And it doesn't have to be your faith in God, but there's all kinds of people who they believed in God and then somebody in their family died and then their faith was shaken. And that always seems sort of goofy to me. I've never been in that situation. I mean, I've known people who have died, but I wasn't a particularly devout person. And then somebody died and I reacted to it in a certain way. But you have to imagine that even though that person had not yet experienced someone close to them dying, and by the way, I'm talking about people like Darwin and Emerson. I'm not talking about dummies on the street. These are notable people from history who somebody dies and it rocks their faith. And that has never made any sense to me because I want to ask them, did you not know that people die? Are you just hearing about this now? People die. That's a thing. There is death. And death is a major topic in religion also. So it's not like this is something that isn't addressed in religion. I'm not religious, but if I were, death would not surprise me. It always seems kind of weird when you hear about people for whom it does. I've known people personally that had a similar thing. They weren't very religious, and then their dad died, and then they became religious. So that's the reverse. It's kind of like, for certain people, if there's a death in your immediate surroundings, it flips the switch. If you weren't religious, you become religious, and if you are religious, you become not religious, which what I'm saying equally applies to non-religious people. Did you not know that people die? Had you never thought about that? Like, people die. Anyway, so I think part of what Boethius was doing and what we should be trying to do in our lives is to cultivate a view of the world and of life that can withstand, endure all that life can offer. And having said enough about that, we can now get into some passages from the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. In the first passage that I'm going to read, he describes philosophy appearing to him. And before this, he has been writing self-pityingly about what a terrible situation he's in, sort of letting himself get carried away. And then philosophy shows up and chases away those muses that are whispering in his ear. So it's not only philosophy that's personified, though that's most of the text. There's also these muses whispering in his ear about how terrible everything is, and philosophy is what chases them away. Boethius writes, quote, "Her right hand held a notebook. In her left she bore a staff. And when she saw the muses of poesy standing by my bedside dictating the words of my lamentations, she was moved a while to wrath, and her eyes flashed sternly. 'Who,' said she, 'has allowed yon play-acting wantons to approach this sick man, these who, so far from giving medicine to heal his malady, even feed it with sweet poison? These it is who kill the rich crop of reason with the barren thorns of passion, who accustom men's minds to dis-ease instead of setting them free. Now were it some common man whom your allurements were seducing, as is usually your way, I should be less indignant. On such a one I should not have spent my pains for naught. But this is one nurtured in the Eleatic and academic philosophies. Nay, get ye gone, ye sirens, whose sweetness does not last. Leave him for my muses to tend and heal.' At these words of upbraiding, the whole band, in deepened sadness, with downcast eyes and blushes that confessed their shame, dolefully left the chamber." End quote. So that too is an extension of this metaphor, of this personification of philosophy, and in this case, these muses of passion that are competing for influence over what Boethius is thinking about. In this next passage, he references the fates, whether the execution or torture or exile of 6 famous men from history, and they are worth going over because otherwise it can be kind of hard to understand the passage. And they are of Anaxagoras, Socrates, Zeno, Arius, Seneca, and Soranus. And just to go over them briefly, Anaxagoras is from the 5th century BC. He had a theory about life in the universe, that it was distributed all across the universe in the form of a kind of space dust, which is an early example of the idea that there's life on other planets. He also explained eclipses and said that the sun was a very big fiery mass, which was a pretty good theory at the time. And he also tried to explain rainbows and meteors. So he was an early example of what we would today call a scientist, but he was charged with impiety and went into exile. Socrates, of course, doesn't need much explanation, but it's worth noting in order to gradually build a timeline of when these guys lived that he lived in the 5th century BC. Also, he was, after a trial, sentenced to death by drinking the hemlock, which he did. Then there's Zeno of Elea, who is also 5th century BC, and he is best known for his paradoxes, which are called Zeno's paradoxes, and we've talked about them on this podcast. I think in the episode discussing Sextus Empiricus, we got into them a little bit. Zeno was arrested on charges of having conspired to overthrow Nearchus, who was the tyrant of that period, and he was reportedly tortured, and some accounts say that Zeno was executed over that. Then there's Arius, who is much later. He's 3rd century, and he's the father of a doctrine that's called Arianism, which, as I understand it, is a subtle difference from what later became dominant Christian theology. And the difference is that Arianism taught that God existed first and later on begot Christ, the Son of God, whereas the dominant theology later became that God the Son and God the Father were co-eternal. They both existed outside of time. This is the kind of thing that certain people apparently can get very worked up about because the two assertions are equally unprovable. Arius was eventually exiled for this, though he came back later and they worked it out. Seneca the Younger was a major Stoic philosopher who was certainly worth reading, and he was sentenced to death. And Quintus Valerius Serranus was a poet and grammarian in the 2nd century BC in Rome, who was executed because he said the secret ancient name of Rome. That's the reason it was given, but there might have been something else going on there also. Each of those 6 guys warrants a lot more study, particularly, of course, Socrates and Seneca, but also Arius and Zeno and Soranus and Anaxagoras. None of them are unimportant, and they're all just mentioned in passing in this one little sentence or two in this piece by Boethius. And that's part of why I like to, when I'm reading something like this and I don't know what the writer is talking about, to look into it, because you often find very interesting stuff. And that passage reads, quote, "It may be you know not of the banishment of Anaxagoras, of the poison drought of Socrates, nor of Zeno's torturing, because these things happened in a distant country. Yet might you have learned the fate of Arius, of Seneca, of Soranus, whose stories are neither old nor unknown to fame. These men were brought to destruction for no other reason than that, settled as they were in my principles, their lives were a manifest contrast to the ways of the wicked. So there is nothing you should wonder at, if on the seas of this life we are tossed by storm blasts, seeing that we have made it our chiefest aim to refuse compliance with evildoers." End quote. And the person speaking there is philosophy. That's why she says, settled as they were in my principles. Boethius, speaking through her, lists these 6 guys as examples of men who were punished for adhering to philosophy, to truth, to virtue. And all of Consolation of Philosophy is divided up between prose and verse sections. It's mostly prose, but in between the prose sections there are little short poems, and they're translated from Latin, of course, and they're a little bit sing-song in their rhyming in the translation that I read, but some of them are still quite good, and so I'll read a few of them. Each poem reiterates the prose passage that came before it. So there's a prose passage, and then there'll be a short poem that's kind of about what the prose passage was about. So here's one of those. Quote, "Whoso calm, serene, sedate, sets his foot on haughty fate, firm and steadfast, come what will, keeps his mien unconquered still, him the rage of furious seas, tossing high wild menaces, nor the flames from smoky forges that Vesuvius disgorges, nor the bolt that from the sky smites the tower, can terrify. Why then should you feel affright at the tyrant's weakling might? Dread him not, nor fear no harm. But who to hope or fear gives way, lost his bosom's rightful sway, he has cast away his shield, like a coward fled the field. He has forged all unaware fetters, his own neck must bear." End quote. In most of these passages, philosophy is speaking, but in the next one, Boethius is explaining himself to philosophy. And he says, "You're the one who told me that I should go into public life. Plato says states would be happy if their kings are philosophers or their philosophers are kings. And so I went into politics, and look what happened. I tried to be honest and loyal and truthful, and now look where I am." And that's an interesting objection, because it's possible that even today, an honest person, somebody trying to be a philosopher who went into politics, they probably wouldn't end up being put to death, but they would probably get knocked out of the game in one way or another before too long. Anyway, Boethius says, quote, "You have enjoined by Plato's mouth the maxim that states would be happy, either if philosophers ruled them, or if it should so befall that their rulers would turn philosophers. By his mouth likewise you did point out this imperative reason why philosophers should enter public life, to wit, lest if the reins of government be left to unprincipled and profligate citizens, trouble and destruction should come upon the good. Following these precepts, I have tried to apply in the business of public administration the principles which I learned from you in leisured seclusion. You are my witness, and that divinity who has implanted you in the hearts of the wise, that I brought to my duties no aim but zeal for the public good. For this cause I have become involved in bitter and irreconcilable feuds, and, as happens inevitably, if a man holds fast to the independence of conscience, I have had to think nothing of giving offense to the powerful in the cause of justice. How often have I encountered and balked Conegastus in his assaults on the fortunes of the weak? How often have I thwarted Trigilla, steward of the king's household, even when his villainous schemes were as good as accomplished? How often have I risked my position and influence to protect poor wretches from the false charges innumerable with which they were forever being harassed by the greed and license of the barbarians? No one has ever drawn me aside from justice to oppression." End quote. Boethius was probably writing this in part to make his case to avoid execution, but in doing so, it's unlikely he would have listed reasons that were not true. He would have pointed to good things he had done that people knew about, because that would be more convincing. And it's also worth noting that we don't know who Conegastus and Trigilla are. I can't even find a good pronunciation guide for that name. Maybe somebody else knows better how to pronounce that second name. Whereas we're still talking about Boethius. He later writes, quote, "It comes to pass that reputation is the first of all things to abandon the unfortunate. I remember with chagrin how perverse is popular report, how various and discordant men's judgments," end quote. So he's talking about how worthless popular opinion is. In these next couple passages, philosophy is talking about how you can really only become disheartened because you forget yourself. You forget who you are. Quote, "When I saw you sorrowful in tears, I straightway knew you wretched and an exile. But how far distant that exile I should not know, had not your own speech revealed it. Yet how far indeed from your country have you not been banished, but rather have strayed, or if you will have it banishment, have banished yourself. For no one else could ever lawfully have had this power over you." And skipping ahead, "It is not so much the aspect of this place which moves me as your aspect. Not so much the library walls set off with glass and ivory which I miss, as the chamber of your mind, wherein I once placed not books, but that which gives books their value, the doctrines which my books contain." End quote. And a bit later, along similar lines, quote, "Now, said she, I know another cause of your disease, one too of grave moment. You have ceased to know your own nature. So then, I have made full discovery both of the causes of your sickness and the means of restoring your health. It is because forgetfulness of yourself has bewildered your mind that you have bewailed you as an exile, as one stripped of the blessings that were his. It is because you know not the end of existence that you deem abominable and wicked men to be happy and powerful." End quote. In this next passage, she's talking about lost fortune. She says, quote, "If I have thoroughly ascertained the character and causes of your sickness, you are pining with regretful longing for your former fortune. It is the changes you deem of this fortune that has so wrought upon your mind. Well do I understand that Siren's manifold wiles, the fatal charm of the friendship she pretends for her victim, so long as she is scheming to entrap them, how she unexpectedly abandons them and leaves them overwhelmed with insupportable grief. Think you of her nature, character, and deserts, and you will soon acknowledge that in her you have neither possessed, nor have you lost, anything of any worth. I think I need not spend much pains in bringing this to your mind, since even when she was still with you, even while she was caressing you, you used to assail her in manly terms, to rebuke her with maxims drawn from my holy treasure house. But all sudden changes of circumstance bring inevitably a certain commotion of spirit. Thus it has come to pass that you also for a while have been parted from your mind's tranquility." End quote. So she's getting warmed up for what she's going to say next. She says, fortune is not such an important thing. You're worried about your lost fortune, but you really haven't lost much. And you used to curse fortune and say, I don't need any of that. And though you've forgotten this for a moment because you're in a commotion of spirit, if we talk about it a little bit, you'll remember. And I really like this next part because this ongoing personification throughout this whole piece, where philosophy is one person talking to Boethius, and now philosophy is talking about fortune as another person, as a figure, as a character who has traits. She's fickle. She doesn't reveal herself to everybody at first. She comes upon a person and makes them happy, and then suddenly she disappears without warning. It's an effective passage. I'll leave it to Boethius. Here it is. Quote, "Some strange unwonted sight, I think, have your eyes seen. You think fortune to have changed toward you. You are mistaken. Such ever were her ways, ever such her nature. Rather in her very mutability has she preserved towards you her true constancy. Such was she when she loaded you with caresses, when she deluded you with the allurements of a false happiness. You have found out how changeful is the face of the blind goddess. She who still veils herself from others has fully discovered to you her whole character. If you like her, take her as she is and do not complain. If you abhor her perfidy, turn from her in disdain, renounce her, for baneful are her delusions. The very thing which is now the cause of your great grief ought to have brought you tranquility. You have been forsaken by one of whom no one can be sure that she will not forsake him. Or do you indeed set value on a happiness that is certain to depart? Again I ask, is fortune's presence dear to you if she cannot be trusted to stay, and though she will bring sorrow when she is gone? Why, if she cannot be kept at pleasure, and her flight overwhelms with calamity. What is this fleeting visitant but a token of coming trouble?" End quote. And I think this view of fortune in this case referring to the ups in life, when things are going well in one way or another, and especially when they're going well for a long period. This view of that as something that maybe is not so important and also cannot be trusted is a more calm and steady way to view life. Because as happy as you are when things are going well, you will be unhappy when things inevitably go badly. And a lot of modern thought, if you can call it that, would take that view as pessimistic. And it's not pessimistic, it's just true. It's just the nature of this situation that we find ourselves in. We are humans on a planet trying to get by, bouncing off of each other in various ways. And sometimes things go well for us and sometimes they don't. It's inevitable that the wheel of fortune will keep turning. And we should have an outlook that makes us ready for that so that when it turns, we can continue on toward whatever we're working on. And here philosophy uses that very same phrase. Quote, "Did you commit your sails to the winds? You would voyage not where your intention was to go, but where the winds drive you. Did you entrust your seed to the fields? You would set off the fruitful years against the barren. You have resigned yourself to the sway of fortune. You must submit to your mistress's caprices. What? Are you verily striving to stay the swing of the revolving wheel? O stupidest of mortals, if it takes to standing still, it ceases to be the wheel of fortune." End quote. And by the way, in all these passages, it's philosophy who is speaking to Boethius, but it's obviously Boethius writing it. So Boethius is writing, but the voice speaking in the writing is philosophy. I'm explaining that in case I mix it up. If I say Boethius writes, it's not necessarily Boethius speaking. Most of these passages are philosophy speaking. Now she elaborates further on the point she was making by speaking through fortune's voice. So we have Boethius speaking through philosophy, who is speaking through fortune. So let's hear what she says. Quote, "Now I would fain also reason with you a little in fortune's own words. Do you observe whether her contentions be just? Man, she might say, why do you pursue me with your daily complainings? What wrong have I done you? What goods of yours have I taken from you? Choose as you will a judge, and let us dispute before him concerning the rightful ownership of wealth and rank. If you succeed in showing that any one of these things is the true property of mortal man, I freely grant those things to be yours which you claim. When nature brought you forth out of your mother's womb, I took you, naked and destitute as you were. I cherished you with my substance, and in the partiality of my favor for you, I brought you up somewhat too indulgently, and this it is which now makes you rebellious against me. I surrounded you with a royal abundance of all those things that are in my power. Now it is my pleasure to draw back my hand. You have reason to thank me for the use of what was not your own. You have no right to complain as if you had lost what was wholly yours. Why, then, do you bemoan yourself? I have done you no violence. Wealth, honor, and all such things are placed under my control. My handmaidens know their mistress. With me they come, and at my going they depart. I might boldly affirm that if those things, the loss of which you lament, had been yours, you could never have lost them. Am I alone to be forbidden to do what I will with my own? Unrebuked, the skies now reveal the brightness of day, now shroud the daylight in the darkness of night. The year may now engarland the face of the earth with flowers and fruits, now disfigure it with storms and cold. The sea is permitted to invite with smooth and tranquil surface today, tomorrow to roughen with wave and storm. Shall man's insatiate greed bind me to a constancy foreign to my character? This is my art. This is the game I never cease to play. I turn the wheel that spins. I delight to see the high come down and the low ascend. Mount up if you will, but only on condition that you will not think it a hardship to come down when the rules of my game require it." End quote. Of course, very few people even have the fortune that Boethius had, but at the same time, not many of us are put to death at the age of 44 or 45. We do, however, have ups and downs in our life, and those ups and downs might be brief in either direction, or they can be major events, or they can be long stretches of years where things are either going great or not going so great. And I love how in these short passages, Boethius really articulates these circumstances in such a way that we cannot help but have a rational response to them. This view that he's expressing by having philosophy talk and then having fortune talk, it just immediately puts you in that place where you say, of course, maybe this terrible thing happened, but who am I to insist that it not happen? Everything went so well for such a long time. When I was in my undergrad, I was working full-time and taking classes at night, and I was really broke for that whole period because I had to spend all my money on tuition. And I remember reading something where somebody had written something like, at first you worry because you don't have enough. And then once you have enough, you worry that you might lose it. And I remember reading that and thinking, no way is that true. If I just had enough to buy my groceries and pay my rent and pay for my school, I would be so happy and I would never worry about anything. And now, thank goodness, I've been in that position for a while where I can mostly meet my expenses. I'm not rich, but I'm fine. And now I'm worried about how things could go sideways and trying to anticipate that and plan for it. And this philosophy doesn't say don't plan, don't prepare, but it's even better than that. It says don't worry about it. If things go badly, that's fine too, and you'll handle it. So while you're preparing, don't let yourself get too worked up about what might happen if you suddenly have a big medical expense or whatever it might be. You'll figure it out. And also, not only is it not a big deal, but it's part of life. Just as the night follows the day, just as the weather patterns change and they go from sunny to stormy and sunny again, that's part of the thing. It's not things going off script. That is the script. That is a central and foundational aspect of life as a human. And now here's a short poem about that. Quote, though plenty pour her gifts with a lavish hand, numberless as the stars, countless as the sand, will the race of man content cease to murmur and lament? Nay, though God all bounteous, give gold at man's desire, honors, rank, and fame, content not a whit is nearer, but an all-devouring greed yawns with ever-widening need. Then what bounds can e'er restrain this wild lust of having, when with each new bounty fed grows the frantic craving? He is never rich whose fear sees grim want forever near. End quote. Then philosophy, speaking in her own voice again, says, quote, if you compare the extent and bounds of your blessings and misfortunes, you cannot deny that you are still fortunate. Or if you esteem not yourself favored by fortune, in that your then seeming prosperity has departed, deem not yourself wretched, since what you now believe to be calamitous passes too. What? Are you but now come suddenly and a stranger to the scene of this life? Do you think that there is any stability in human affairs when man himself vanishes away in the swift course of time? End quote. And another short poem. Quote, smooth and tranquil lies the deep, while the winds are hushed in sleep. Soon when angry tempests lash, wild and high the billows dash. Thus if nature's changing face holds not still a moment's space, fleeting deem man's fortunes, deem bliss as transient as a dream. One law only standeth fast, things created cannot last. End quote. Later along a similar line, philosophy says, quote, we are gaining a little ground, said she, if there is something in your lot wherewith you are not yet altogether discontented. But I cannot stomach your daintiness when you complain with such violence of grief and anxiety because your happiness falls short of completeness. Why, who enjoys such settled felicity as not to have some quarrel with the circumstances of his lot? A troublous matter are the conditions of human bliss. Either they are never realized in full, or never stay permanently. One has abundant riches, but is shamed by his ignoble birth. Another is conspicuous for his nobility, but through the embarrassments of poverty would prefer to be obscure. A third, richly endowed with both, laments the loneliness of an unwedded life. Another, though happily married, is doomed to childlessness and nurses his wealth for a stranger to inherit. Yet another, blessed with children, mournfully bewails the misdeeds of son or daughter. Wherefore it is not easy for anyone to be at perfect peace with the circumstances of his lot. There lurks in each several portion something which they who experience it not know nothing of, but which makes the sufferer wince. Besides, the more favored a man is by fortune, the more fastidiously sensitive is he. Unless all things answer to his whim, he is overwhelmed by the most trifling misfortunes because he is utterly unschooled in adversity. So petty are the trifles which rob the most fortunate of perfect happiness. How many are there, do you imagine, who would think themselves nigh heaven if but a small portion from the wreck of your fortune should fall to them? This very place which you call exile is to them that dwell therein their native land. So true is it that nothing is wretched, but thinking makes it so. And conversely, every lot is happy if borne with equanimity. Who is so blessed by fortune as not to wish to change his state if once he gives rein to a rebellious spirit? With how many bitternesses is the sweetness of human felicity blended? And even if that sweetness seem to him to bring delight in the enjoying, yet he cannot keep it from departing when it will. How manifestly wretched, then, is the bliss of earthly fortune, which lasts not forever with those whose temper is equable, and can give no perfect satisfaction to the anxious-minded. Why then, ye children of mortality, seek ye from without that happiness whose seat is only within us? Error and ignorance bewilder you." End quote. I'm reading these passages more or less without comment because they just stand on their own. This is a really powerful, short little book, and it's not at all surprising that it's remained for 1,500 years. And a lot of people alive today are burning a lot of fuel on self-help books and therapy and pharmaceuticals, for that matter, when just taking a different perspective can just even you out. Yes, you have to try to organize your life and do good work and keep things secure, but also you have to be ready in case a meteor comes hurtling out of the night sky and just blows up everything you've built, because that could happen too, and you might not be able to prepare for it, except by doing so philosophically and spiritually. It's interesting that Boethius is not often listed as a Stoic philosopher. At least, I haven't seen him on such a list. If you ask people to list Stoic philosophers, they'll say Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. Those are the ones that come quickly to mind. But Boethius here is bringing us some really good Stoic thought. But what's interesting is he just calls it philosophy. This is the consolation of philosophy. But what he's describing is adiaphora, indifference to the vicissitudes, which is a central Stoic concept. Here's another passage. Quote, "It is plain that fortune cannot aspire to bestow happiness by reason of its instability. And besides, a man borne along by this transitory felicity must either know or not know its instability. If he knows not, how poor is a happiness which depends on the blindness of ignorance? If he knows it, he must fear to lose a happiness whose loss he believes to be possible. Wherefore a never-ceasing fear suffers him not to be happy. Or does he count the possibility of this loss a trifling matter? Insignificant, then, must be the good whose loss can be borne so equably." End quote. So here Boethius, though philosophy is speaking, is doing this antiquities thing of going through all the possibilities. There's this transitory happiness. Either the guy knows about it or he doesn't. If he doesn't know about it, then he's only happy because he's ignorant. If he knows about it, then he must be worried about the loss. If he's not worried about the loss of something, then how can he think it's a valuable thing if it doesn't matter if he loses it? This is all how he demonstrates that initial point, that it's plain that fortune cannot bestow happiness because of its instability. And yet that is where we are seeking our happiness. And again, this is not to encourage a nihilism where you shouldn't try to build anything, or you shouldn't have goals, or you shouldn't try to achieve something. But if you want to have mental tranquility, if you want to have some peace in your life, in your soul, in your mind, you should not lean on fortune for that, because fortune is fickle. You have to lean on something inside yourself, something solid and fixed, and that doesn't depend on these things outside of you that are outside of your control and that change constantly. And the point to remember about the modern world is that lots of people have a very significant financial interest in you doing exactly that, in you depending on fortune for your happiness, in you trying to get more money and you trying to get more stuff. The economy runs on this. The global economy runs on this belief that external things are the source of your happiness. If you're somebody who looks at a commercial for a new status symbol and you say, "No thanks, that's cool, but I've got my endogenous equanimity, I've got my peace just sort of springing from within myself, just at the joy of being alive and being able to do some good, honest work," you can't sell to a person like that. That guy's not going to buy anything. So all of the advertising budgets of every company in the world, which combined makes up a significant portion of the GDP of the world, are devoted to trying to convince people that they need a certain thing to be happy. They're trying to crush the specific idea that Boethius is promoting here. And I don't say that to mean that it's a conspiracy or something. It's just the unconscious result of a lot of institutions trying to sell products. So if you find yourself trying to cultivate this idea in yourself, trying to find that inner well deep in your soul from which you can draw a solid, calm peace and stability in your mind, and if you find that to be difficult, don't be discouraged, because the reason it's difficult is because there are many, many forces with a lot of resources at their disposal trying to get you to think exactly not that. You really have to cultivate it like you would a garden. You have to water it and pay attention to it and make sure it doesn't get crushed and everything. And here's a short little poem about that. Quote, "Who founded firm and sure would ever live secure, in spite of storm and blast, immovable and fast. Whoso would fain deride the ocean's threatening tide, his dwelling should not seek on sands or mountain peak. Upon the mountain's height the storm winds wreak their spite. The shifting sands disdain their burden to sustain. Do you these perils flee, fair though the prospect be, and fix your resting place on some low rock's sure base. Then, though the tempests roar, seas thunder on the shore, you in your stronghold, blessed and undisturbed, shall rest, live all your days serene, and mock the heavens' spleen." End quote. And here's another passage. Quote, "What seek ye by all this noisy outcry about fortune? To chase away poverty, I ween, by means of abundance. And yet ye find the result just contrary. Why, this varied array of precious furniture needs more accessories for its protection. It is a true saying that they want most who possess most, and conversely they want very little who measure their abundance by nature's requirements, not by the superfluity of vain display. Have you no good of your own implanted within you, that you seek your goods in things external and separate? Is the nature of things so reversed that a creature divine by right of reason can in no other way be splendid in his own eyes, save by the possession of lifeless chattels? Yet, while other things are content with their own, you, who in your intellect are godlike, seek from the lowest of things adornment for a nature of supreme excellence, and perceive not how great a wrong you do your Maker. And skipping ahead a little, if that in which each finds its good is plainly more precious than that whose good it is, by your own estimation, you put yourselves below the vilest things, when you deem these vile things to be your good." End quote. So he's saying, don't you have any good in yourself? Why do you need these goods around you and these external things and this furniture, or the car, or whatever it might be? He says, you who in your intellect are godlike. And that doesn't mean that we're like gods, that we're just so smart. It just means that we have reason. We have a mind. We can think and we can reason through things. That is the most amazing thing in the universe. And now you're going, but my phone is 3 years old. I got to get a new one. And then he says that the thing that adorns the thing must be superior to what it adorns. And so when you desire a thing, you put yourself below it. And then he says, quote, "Indeed, man is so constituted that he then only excels other things when he knows himself. But he is brought lower than the beasts if he loses his self-knowledge." End quote. This is the self-knowledge that he's talking about. The awareness that you, with your mind and your reason, are already more amazing than whatever brand is trying to sell you, whatever they're trying to sell you. The only way you can fail to be is if you don't realize that. And that's not to pump you up and say you're super special or something. It's just that the human mind is so amazing. And we have so much potential in us that we can only be made to think that we need this external stuff by first being made to forget that we have this mind, this potential. And of course, potential isn't anything unless you do something with it, unless you build something, create something, discover something. But you can't buy that from anybody. Nobody can sell it to you. You have to do it yourself. And for that reason, there isn't a big marketing push to get people to build things unless they're going to build something using a product that somebody is selling. And here's another line making that point again, quote, "How extravagant then is this error of yours in thinking that anything can be embellished by adornments not its own? It cannot be. For if such accessories add any luster, it is the accessories that get the praise, while that which they veil and cover remains in its pristine ugliness." End quote. That's harsh. You think that any adornment can embellish you. If you're a jerk in a nice suit or a nice car, you're still a jerk. The embellishment gets the praise and you remain in your pristine ugliness. That's another reason to focus on what's in you. Here's another one that's a little bit different. Quote, "You who now dreads pike and sword might have trolled a carol in the robber's face had you entered the road of life with empty pockets. O wondrous blessedness of perishable wealth whose acquisition robs you of security." End quote. That one's interesting. So he's saying that people are actually more brave when they have less. You might have trolled a carol in the robber's face had you entered the road of life with empty pockets, but instead you dread the pike and sword, and perishable wealth robs you of security. Again, this is not to say don't try to acquire wealth, but it's worth noticing. It's worth noticing how it affects your perception. And then he says something about rank and high office. Quote, "What now shall I say of rank and power, whereby because you know not true power and dignity ye hope to reach the sky? Yet when rank and power have fallen to the worst of men, did ever an Etna, belching forth flame and fiery deluge, work such mischief?" And by the way, if you hadn't guessed, Mount Etna is a volcano in Italy, which is to this day still active. It's the tallest active volcano in Italy and one of the tallest in Europe. It's interesting that it has remained active for at least 1,500 years. And he's saying that when bad men reach a high rank, they do more damage than Mount Etna does.
And then later, quote, if as happens but rarely these prerogatives are conferred on virtuous men, it is only the virtue of those who exercise them that pleases. So it appears that honor comes not to virtue from rank, but to rank from virtue, end quote. So he's saying, you're so worried about getting promoted, becoming a CEO, becoming a congressman, whatever it is, when really what matters is being virtuous. Now, of course, to be virtuous and a CEO or virtuous and a congressman would probably be better than being just virtuous. But if you had to pick one, it's better to be just virtuous. Now, this next one is interesting. He's saying something a little different here. Boethius writes, quote, wealth cannot extinguish insatiable greed, nor has power ever made him master of himself, whom vicious lusts kept bound in indissoluble fetters. Dignity conferred on the wicked not only fails to make them worthy, but contrarily reveals and displays their unworthiness. Why does it so happen? Because you take pleasure in calling by false names things whose nature is quite incongruous thereto, by names which are easily proved false by the very effects of the things themselves. Even so it is. These riches, that power, this dignity, are none of them rightly so called. Finally, we may draw the same conclusion concerning the whole sphere of fortune, within which there is plainly nothing to be truly desired, nothing of intrinsic excellence. For she neither always joins herself to the good, nor does she make good men of those to whom she is united. End quote. He's saying that all these things are misnamed. Riches, power, dignity, and fortune. We're calling them by the wrong name. That riches are not riches, power is not power, dignity is not dignity, and fortune is not fortune. That's one of those thoughts that loosens up your brain a little bit, makes you realize that you've been assuming some things. And of course, you have to allow for the Nietzschean devil's advocate here, that who says that riches are not riches or power is not power is people who don't have riches and power. And there might be something to that also. But it is a fact that having more money makes your life more expensive, for example. And graveyards around the world are filled with people who were killed by things that appeared fortunate at first. And this one is a bit longer, and it's Boethius speaking now. Quote, you know yourself that ambition for worldly success has but little swayed me, yet I have desired opportunity for action, lest virtue, in default of exercise, should languish away. Then she, this is that last infirmity, which is able to allure minds which, though of noble quality, have not yet been molded to any exquisite refinement by the perfecting of the virtues. I mean, the love of glory and fame for high services rendered to the common weal. End quote. And as an aside, weal is W-E-A-L, meaning well-being, not W-H-E-E-L, the thing that turns. Now back to it, quote, and yet consider with me how poor and unsubstantial a thing this glory is. The whole of this earth's globe, as you've learned from the demonstration of astronomy, compared with the expanse of heaven is found no bigger than a point. That is to say, if measured by the vastness of heaven's sphere, it is held to occupy absolutely no space at all. Now, of this so insignificant portion of the universe, it is about a fourth part, as Ptolemy's proofs have taught us, which is inhabited by living creatures known to us. If from this fourth part you take away in thought all that is usurped by seas and marshes, or lies a vast waste of waterless desert, barely is an exceeding narrow area left for human habitation. You then, who are shut in and imprisoned in this merest fraction of a point space, do you take thought for the blazoning of your fame, for the spreading abroad of your renown? Why, what amplitude or magnificence has glory when confined to such narrow and petty limits? Besides, the straitened bounds of this scant dwelling place are inhabited by many nations differing widely in speech and usages and modes of life. To many of these, from the difficulty of travel, from diversities of speech, from want of commercial intercourse, the fame not only of individual men, but even of cities is unable to reach. Why, in Cicero's days, as he himself somewhere points out, the fame of the Roman Republic had not yet crossed the Caucasus, and yet by that time her name had grown formidable to the Parthians and other nations of those parts. See you then how narrow, how confined is the glory you take pains to spread abroad and extend. Can the fame of a single Roman penetrate where the glory of the Roman name fails to pass? Moreover, the customs and institutions of different races agree not together, so that what is deemed praiseworthy in one country is thought punishable in another. Wherefore, if any love the applause of fame, it shall not profit him to publish his name among many peoples. Then each must be content to have the range of his glory limited to his own people. The splendid immortality of fame must be confined within the bounds of a single race. What's more, how many of high renown in their own times have been lost in oblivion for want of a record? Indeed, of what avail are written records even, which with their authors are overtaken by the dimness of age after a somewhat longer time? But you, when you think on future fame, fancy it an immortality that you are begetting for yourselves. Why, if you scan the infinite spaces of eternity, what room have you left for rejoicing in the durability of your name? Verily, if a single moment's space be compared with 10,000 years, it has a certain relative duration, however little, since each period is definite. But this same number of years, and a number many times as great, cannot even be compared with endless duration. For indeed, finite periods may in a sort be compared one with another, but a finite and an infinite never. So it comes to pass that fame, though it extend to ever so wide a space of years, if it be compared to never-lessening eternity, seems not short-lived merely, but altogether nothing. But as for you, you know not how to act aright unless it be to court the popular breeze, and win the empty applause of the multitude. Nay, ye abandon the superlative worth of conscience and virtue, and ask a recompense from the poor words of others. Let me tell you how cleverly one did mock the shallowness of this sort of arrogance. A certain man assailed one who had put on the name of philosopher as a cloak to pride and vainglory, not for the practice of real virtue, and added, "Now shall I know if you are a philosopher, if you bear reproaches calmly and patiently." The other, for a while, affected to be patient, and having endured to be abused, cried out derisively, "Now do you see that I'm a philosopher?" The other, with biting sarcasm, retorted, "I should have, had you held your peace." Moreover, what concern have choice spirits, for it is of such men we speak, men who seek glory by virtue? What concern, I say, have these with fame after the dissolution of the body in death's last hour? End quote. In short, he's saying that fame is useless. And most of us are not trying to achieve fame, but many more of us would want status in some way. You want to be respected among people who you admire. You want to feel that you've contributed something or reached some level intellectually. And I certainly think that that's a positive thing. I think that's one of the fuels of civilization, is the desire to prove yourself in some way. And I think Boethius would agree with that, but he would also say, but don't fool yourself on your way to proving yourself. Memento mori. It's coming. And here is a poem about that. Quote, "Oh, let him who pants for glory's reward, deeming glory all in all, look and see how wide the heaven expands, earth's enclosing bounds how small. Shame it is, if your proud swelling glory may not fill this narrow room. Why then strive so vainly, O ye proud ones, to escape your mortal doom? Though your name to distant regions brooded, or the earth be widely spread, though full many a loft-sounding title on your house its lustre shed, death at all this pomp and glory spurneth when his hour draweth nigh. Shrouds alike the exalted and the humble, levels lowest and most high. Where are now the bones of staunch Fabricius, Brutus, Cato? Where are they? Lingering fame with a few graven letters doth their empty name display. But to know the great dead is not given from a gilded name alone. Nay, ye all alike must lie forgotten. 'Tis not you that fame makes known. Fondly do you deem life's little hour lengthened by fame's mortal breath. There but waits you when this too is taken, at the last, a second death." End quote. And that can seem kind of heavy if you haven't spent time thinking about it. And though we are born into this life without having been consulted on it, nobody asked us, and at some point we have to die, I think we can do ourselves a simple, sincere honor by staring that fact right in the face and not being afraid of it. And maybe that's easy for a young guy to say. I still have some time to have some fun. But Seneca says, "No man is any frailer than another, no man more certain of the morrow." This could be my last podcast. In fact, I might not even get this uploaded to the internet. Anything could happen. And living life aware of this foundational, final fact is better than living unaware of it or pretending it's not there. And there are all too many people who are all too ready to sell you something to distract you from this. But I truly think that this life is sweeter, it's better, more beautiful, more intense, more energetic, more exciting when you know that it will end. It's an exclamation point concluding a majestic sentence. Getting back to fortune, Boethius writes, quote, "Truly I believe that ill fortune is of more use to men than good fortune. For good fortune, when she wears the guise of happiness and most seems to caress, is always lying. Ill fortune is always truthful, since in changing she shows her inconstancy. The one deceives, the other teaches. The one enchains the mind of those who enjoy her favor by the semblance of delusive good. The other delivers them by the knowledge of the frail nature of happiness. Accordingly, you may see the one fickle, shifting as the breeze, and ever self-deceived. the other sober-minded, alert, and wary, by reason of the very discipline of adversity. Finally, good fortune, by her allurements, draws men far from the true good. Ill fortune ofttimes draws men back to true good with grappling irons. Again, do you think that it should be thought a trifling boon that this cruel, this odious fortune has discovered to you the hearts of your faithful friends, that the other hid from you alike the faces of the true friends and of the false? But in departing she has taken away her friends and left you yours? What price would you not have given for this service in the fullness of your prosperity when you seemed to yourself fortunate? Cease then to seek the wealth you have lost, since in true friends you have found the most precious of all riches." End quote. So he's saying that bad fortune is actually better than good fortune. It makes you stronger and tougher and shows you who your real friends are. And here are a few short ones. Quote, "I do not speak of how very little suffices for nature, and how for avarice nothing is enough. Wherefore, if wealth cannot get rid of want, and makes new wants of its own, how can you believe that it bestows independence?" End quote. And then of popular favor, quote, "Many have won a great name through the mistaken beliefs of the multitude, and what can be imagined more shameful than that? Nay, they who are praised falsely must needs themselves blush at their own praises. And even when praise is won by merit, still, how does it add to the good conscience of the wise man, who measures his good not by popular repute, but by the truth of inner conviction?" End quote. So he's saying if you're popular and you don't deserve it, that's shameful. And if you're popular and you do deserve it, it's still better to just rely on your own conviction rather than on the fickle and changing views of the populace. And he adds, quote, "As to popular favor, I do not think it even worthy of mention in this place, since it never cometh of judgment and never lasts steadily." End quote. So those are the passages from On the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius that I wanted to show you. His is really an interesting life. Without going too deep into history and verifying everything that he says, if we take what he says and what is generally said about him at face value, he is somebody who tried to do the right thing and suffered for it. And he also lived at this transition between the classical period and the Middle Ages. And he tried to bridge these two continents of thought. And in doing so, he gives us a lot to think about in terms of on what we should put importance. And just because there is death, that does not at all mean that our lives are meaningless. I think that trying to sustain this ongoing 10,000-year project of civilization for as long as we can is a worthwhile goal. And who can even imagine what shape it might take in 1,000 years? What human civilization might look like then? It might be far more advanced, it might be far less advanced, but the direction that it goes in is going to be determined by what we do in our lives. And that matters whether we are around to see it or not. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you will go to my website, vollrathpublishing.com, VOLLRATH publishing.com, and buy some books for your family, for your friends, for yourself. I have a very nice edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's got 97 footnotes that define some of the more unusual vocabulary words that she uses. I commissioned an original cover. I've got it at a good price, free shipping. I'm very pleased with the print quality. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an excellent book. If you haven't read it, you should. If you've read it, but you know someone who hasn't, you should buy a copy for them. They should read it. Really excellent book, especially, I was thinking about this the other day, with artificial intelligence becoming a bigger part of our lives. The question about creating a monster that might destroy us has perhaps never been more relevant than it is today. And that's, of course, the center of the story of Dr. Frankenstein. Anyway, we put a lot of work into producing a nice edition of that book, and I hope you will check it out for your own sake. Farewell until next time. Take care, and happy reading.